One more? Yes, he's got a mic for you.
Hello, hello, hello. Excellent. I think we're just going to get started now. Sorry about the registration issue for some people downstairs. Welcome to Wunderman Thompson. So I don't know how many of you actually know the space we are currently in. We are seated here in one of the oldest advertising agencies in the world. It was J. Walter Thompson before Wunderman, another ad agency, merged with JWT. Unilever has been a client of the advertising firm you're currently seated in here since 110 years. And I do want to ask you all for an applause of Tiffany, who has defeated her communications department and all other forces at play that we were able to use the venue without naming the venue. So Tiffany, thank you so much for letting us into the belly.
I'm happy to host all of you, personally.
The belly of the beast, yes. So, a quick word about myself. My name is Robert Murtfeld. I've been BrittanyKaiser's colleague at Cambridge Analytica. I would say one of the principal colleagues, if we would say so. For a good 3 years, we've been through everything together. And since Brittany decided to go down the route of becoming a whistleblower, I've decided to support her in the endeavor. It's not my personal cup of tea to blow the whistle on somebody. I'm going to take secrets into my grave. But regardless of that, Brittany has done a tremendous job of really showcasing what Cambridge Analytica was all about. She has written very positively about things in her book, which I think is great. And it's really here to show our endorsement for Brittany. So on that note, I don't want to hold back too long from the panel that is going to kick off. So maybe a quick word. Maybe should I introduce you, Tiffany, or do you want to introduce yourself? What do you?
You were always good at this. So
All right. Well, Tiffany and I met at an event of British American Business, which is a trade association. British American Business had hosted an event on data. And Tiffany started speaking about owning your data. It was just 6-8 weeks ago or something of that sort. And owning your data, as you can see by my own pin that I'm wearing, that's Brittany's movement. So I connected those two. And this book launch really came about spontaneously. And it's fantastic to see such a large turnout and interest in the project that both Tiffany and Brittany are going to tell you about. Tiffany is in charge of data science at Wunderman Thompson for quite some large accounts, including Nissan, Dell, what have you.
VW.
Yeah. Which one? BMW?
VW.
VW.
Yeah,
Volkswagen.
Yeah, Nissan was my last account.
You have Volkswagen. Very nice. So on that note, I'm going to give it over to you, Tiffany and Brittany, and you kick it off around data science and targeted in the book launch. All right, thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you for that. And to be fair, that I have to thank Robert, actually. I, unbeknownst to me, had not previously met Brittany, but had been talking about owning your data for actually like a good year or so. And I actually watched The Great Hack right before I went and gave that talk, and was like, oh, there are so many other people out there. And then, lo and behold, Brittany is a big proponent of owning your data, because people should own their data. And so from that, Robert met me. And he has pulled me into this group, and he's the reason that this is happening tonight. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the intro.
And I forgot to say something, the after party is at the Peninsula Hotel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys all for being here so much. Thank you, Robert, for putting this all together, and thank you, Tiffany, for being our kind host. You could imagine my surprise when Robert called me up maybe a month or two ago and said, I've just met one of the lead data scientists in one of the largest ad conglomerates in the world, and she believes that everybody should own their data. That was not what I expected to hear. It was an incredibly pleasant surprise, and ever since we first met, we've been talking about all of the different ways that we can actually further this conversation, and inviting all of you guys here to talk about these concepts how we came about these ideas, and of course, some of our experiences that brought us here, we thought was a good first step. So thank you all for being here for this chat, and we're going to talk through some of these ideas, and also we want to open it up because we know there's a lot of experts in the room that have different viewpoints and come from different industries, so we'd love to make sure that your ideas are up here as well.
Absolutely. So I think the first step would be, tell me a little bit more about how you came to believe people should own their data.
Right. So I spent about a decade working in political campaigning and human rights advocacy before I ended up at a company that you guys all have heard of called Cambridge Analytica. Now, through political campaigning, human rights campaigning, and even brand advertising, I think anybody in this room that's had experience in data-driven communications knows that it's very difficult sometimes to measure the types of impact that you have. And traditionally, when we've been working in communications, measuring impact doesn't always come from advanced data science. You're dealing with much more basic metrics. And sometimes if you have spent so long on a campaign and you're wondering whether people actually care, once you finally come to data science, you realize how incredibly important it is to have access to those advanced tools. All of a sudden, you can see every single thing that you do, every ounce of energy that you put into a project, you know that it's working. People are opening up your communications, people are engaging with them, people are taking action. Now, whether that's to buy a product, or it's to donate to your favorite cause, or it's to actually show up at a voting booth, using data in communications is something that is essential. It's not only essential in communications, it's basically essential in any industry you can possibly think of. Whether you think you work at a data company or not, you work at a data company. Every company, every government department, every nonprofit or organization at all these days is a data company and runs the back end and should run a lot of the decision making of absolutely any organization from any industry. And that's why in 2017, The Economist estimated that data is the most valuable asset on planet Earth. It has surpassed oil and gas in being what runs everything that happens to us every single day. So data is the backbone of absolutely everything. Now, if we start to think about what are a lot of the most other valuable assets on planet Earth, and you're thinking about rare earth metals and oil and gas, you realize that we have come to a point where we look back in history when people have owned all of these very valuable assets, and people at some point were exploited for owning those assets. You wouldn't anytime soon think about showing up to somebody's land and just pumping oil out of the ground without having had a prior, very consensual, contractual agreement with that person who owned that land, and you're going to definitely be paying a portion of your profits back to that person, right? So if you start to realize that we no longer find that behavior acceptable, I think we're going to see a future where we no longer see it as acceptable the way that our data is stolen from us every single day, and has been since the beginning of our digital lives. And it wasn't really until I joined a data science company that I really realized the extent of the surveillance capitalism industry, to borrow an amazing term from Professor Shoshana Zuboff. And when I joined Cambridge Analytica, I was actually doing my PhD in human rights, and I had come from, as I said, a campaigning background, and I was really looking forward to learning how I could be more successful in campaigning. How do I measure impact? And I was pitched by the CEO of Cambridge Analytica that you could use data in order to make sure that you had measurements of effectiveness for every single thing that you did, and that really excited me. As a campaigner, that literally sometimes felt like I was banging my head against a wall, campaigning and having no idea if I had any impact. I wanted to have that data-driven MOE, the measurements of effectiveness. And so I thought, this is great. The more data, the better. That means I can prove that what I'm doing is right and that it's working. And this is fantastic. But then as the years went on, I was at Cambridge for about 3.5 years, and I saw the amount of data brokering that was going on, the purchasing and licensing and trading and selling and bartering even of data between companies, between governments for political, commercial, defense, and even humanitarian purposes, was an industry that was not just a black box. It was an extensive gray area where anything goes. My CEO used to call it the Wild West. And unfortunately, due to the legislative and regulatory frameworks in America, it's still like that today. And I'm sure you have seen more than most people the amount of data that is available to buy and sell and trade. And that's okay when you are selling people cars and toothpaste or a new dress for the summertime. But that starts to not be okay when you are selling people political ideas, or when you're selling people guns advocacy, or when you are selling people hatred of their neighbor. And unfortunately, that's where political communications have come to in this day and age, where anything goes. And the ways that data is used and abused needs to have a complete revamp in the way that we look at that and what we find as acceptable. And through what I learned in working in data-driven political communications and the risks that unregulated data trade actually poses, this is where I started to think, you know what? I think people need to have more control over their data. And I don't mean just terms and conditions that are easier to understand. I mean full control over our data, where I should have to consent to any use cases of my data. So if I don't want a politician to sell me their ideas, then I shouldn't have to be subjected to that. And if I don't want politicians to lie on my social media platform that I now basically view as a daily utility, that I shouldn't have to be subjected to that either. So these are all of the thoughts that led me to eventually becoming a whistleblower and working for the past 1.5 years to change data laws and regulation both in the United States and abroad. So I know that isn't a simple answer, slightly long-winded answer to your question, but it wasn't easy to come to this conclusion when I was in a company that I thought was cutting edge. And I think a lot of people in this room, especially some of my former colleagues from Cambridge Analytica who are here, we didn't exactly see it coming. We didn't join an organization that we thought was going to be abusive of anyone. We thought we were building the future and building a tool that everybody could actually use to do good things with, right? And a lot of people are sitting around in their companies on a day-to-day basis now and thinking as well, I'm building something good. I bet you a lot of people at Facebook still think that. And I'd like to see a future where that could be true, which is why I think having these conversations is so important. Now, you arrived at the same conclusion in a very different way, so I'd love to hear from you where you came to that idea and how you decided that that was something you wanted to speak publicly about.
Absolutely, and then I want to come back to a couple of your comments after that. So I did arrive to it a completely different way. After 12 plus years in the advertising industry and digging in to see how we use data. And the accounts that I've been on have been major brand name accounts, billion-dollar accounts. And we're selling you cars, we're selling you phones, we're selling you dresses. Yes, absolutely. But at the end of the day, we're still digging into your data. One of my favorite bar conversations is I will go and I'll travel a lot. I'll sit next to somebody that I don't know at a bar. They'll inevitably ask me what I do for a living. And then I tell them, I'm like, cool, so manage data analytics. And what I really do is I track everything that you do, right? So did you just pay with your credit card? Great, so we now know who you are, right? So we're gonna buy your credit card data. And we're gonna tie your credit card data from your email address. We're gonna tie that back to your social media accounts, to your Google. We're gonna see where you're traveling to. We're then also gonna tie that to your phone because your phone also has your email address on it. And we're gonna know that you went to this site We're going to know that you searched this. We're going to know that you went to your doctor's office here, that you went to, well, that's not your doctor's office, but I don't know what you're doing there, but that's okay. And we know all of this information, and we are using this to target ads. We're using this to dig in, to understand more and more of who you are. And along the way, too, I also learned a lot about blockchain. Not cryptocurrency, mind you, but actual blockchain. And what I learned there is the distributed ledger system, as well as this idea that you could have a unique identifier that, as of yet, I don't think is quite hackable. I'm sure it's going to get there. But that through this technology, that this provides you with the ability to own your data. It should be like owning a checking account. It should be as simple as you log into a system and you can say, this is who I am, this is what I'm willing to share, and this is what I'm not willing to share. And what that actually does for ad companies and what that does for you is it gives you the ownership. It gives you the ability to make the decision about whether you want to share your data or not. And then what it also does for us is that we have more accurate information. I might have 800 million profiles in a data management platform right now. And those link to things that you guys have done, everything that you do. We collect data on everything that you do. You search the address for here tonight, we have that data. So we would like to just make sure that it's valid. Is this actually who you are? Do you actually want to hear from us? Do you want to share this at all? Because some things should be private. And so I had come to the conclusion about owning your data differently than, obviously from different experiences. But then once I dug into Cambridge Analytica, I watched The Great Hack, and I saw you on there, and I then looked at the Own Your Data. And I was so excited that there was somebody like you out there that had such a great voice that also envisioned the same thing.
Well, thank you so much, one, for watching and to coming to that conclusion without having gone through what I went through. It gives me hope that a lot more people in the ad industry and in different industries around the world that have to use data in their day-to-day life and actually know and believe that data science and artificial intelligence is the future, still see a future where, despite the fact that nobody owns their data right now, that is possible. And it's congruent with the type of future that you see and that you've worked and studied to be in your technical position in order to achieve. And so this is something that I want to make very, very clear, which is something that often gets confused, which is that I am not a privacy campaigner. Shock and awe from someone that worked at Cambridge Analytica. I, in fact, believe in the future of AI and data science. That's why I wanted to learn how to use those tools. I actually believe that AI and data science are going to stop us from ever having the next terrorist attack, stop us from having mass shootings, stop us from even having traffic accidents, stop us from having to deal with cancers and diabetes. But want to know the problem right now? The way that data is managed, we're not in a place where we can actually start to think that we can solve those problems without creating problems that are just as great. So if we want to see a future where we can all comfortably share our medical data with researchers and make sure that cancer gets eradicated from the planet, well, we better exactly be sure of who we're sharing it with, that we can share it securely, that we are consenting to who has access to it, and that we know exactly what it's going to be used for. Because I really think that we do have a future where the only medical data that researchers and pharma companies have access to is not just 18 to 35-year-old young white men that go for beer money in college to do medical exams, right? Because that's the main problem, why women and minorities don't have medicines that work as well on us. It's a lack of access to medical data because everyone is so afraid of medical data being abused. So we're so afraid of medical data being abused, and we have HIPAA compliance and all of this legislation and regulation, but we don't think about the rest of our data sets as being as sensitive as our medical data. Why not? It's kind of confusing, actually, to be honest. Sharing more medical data probably has less harm in terms of the upside of what we could do solving all of these different diseases than the rest of our data, like our location data and all of our purchases, all of our behavioral patterns, everything that we do and exactly where we are at any point in time, where we work, where we live, where our family and friends are. I think that data is a little bit more sensitive sometimes if you start to think of it that way. But that's why it's really important right now for us to get this right, for us to have a legislative and regulatory framework that actually makes sense. And we're getting there. I could go on for a while about all of my favorite new pieces of legislation, but I want to talk a little bit more about the data ownership concept. And to paint a picture most vividly, I would say it's like an Airbnb model. This is how I see it in the future, where if somebody wants to use my data, just like if someone wants to use my house on Airbnb right now, they tell me who they are, how long they want to use it for what, and we agree on a price and I get paid before I hand away the keys. Why can't our data be like that? And it's starting to get that way in Europe due to GDPR, which is not the most fantastic set of legislation, but it's a start. It actually recognizes that your data is your property, and therefore you have to opt in and give explicit consent for what your data is being collected for, where it's going to be held, for how long, and for what purposes is that data going to be used. I remember because when Robert and I were designing some political programs in Europe, we were talking to different parties, and some of them said, oh, well, we don't have just a database that you can use. That's not how it works here. We have a database of people that have consented just to get information on environmental policy, people that only want to be invited to events, people that only want to hear about healthcare. And we can't just send them newsletters. We can't just invite everybody to things. That's not how this works. And, maybe that's a bad thing for trying to get massive things done very quickly, but maybe it's a very good thing for thinking about the transparency and the consent that we should be looking for in our laws and regulations. And so I'd love to know what you think about that.
I think that's pretty interesting. I also think it's interesting that you bring up GDPR. So currently the US, they don't have GDPR here. I know California has passed one law that I think takes effect in January.
In January, yeah.
But what's problematic with the laws right now in the US? What do you think could change?
So the number one issue is that in the United States, we are pre-opted in just because we're here. So because you are in America, your data can be collected from you and used and bought and sold and traded, used for any purpose without your further consent. You're in America, so your data is a free-for-all. Anybody can take it from you and use it for whatever purposes they'd like. Now, that is a situation that shouldn't probably last for very much longer. Senator Ed Markey has had a bill called the Consent Bill in Congress for a little while, which would flip that switch and make us, instead of pre-opted in, we're pre-opted out like you are in Europe, and you have to opt in for your data being collected for specific purposes. So that's number one. That's the most basic principle, and it's why any data company or any company that is considered even propaganda as a service. There's at least 7 different countries that have been identified by our intelligence services, by Oxford University, by a lot of cybersecurity companies, as hosting companies that specifically gather Americans' data in order to not just intervene in our elections, but in our day-to-day lives. The reason why America is the biggest target is because we are the only country that has this endless free flow of data that you don't even have to be an American company or the government to collect. You can be anybody from anywhere around the world and buy explicit personal information, personally identifiable information, PII, like it's called in the industry, without any sort of permission structure. And to anyone that just heard that for the first time, yes, you should be surprised because it's shocking. It's actually shocking that somebody in any country can purchase and license data about us, including where we live, everything about our family, everything we do every day, our location data, without any sort of license, permission, even an LLC in America. You don't need any of that. So that's what we're dealing with right now. But if we start to think about what are some of the other laws, which I think are very important for us to look at, So I said earlier that data is the most valuable asset on planet Earth right now, yet somehow none of us are seeing any of those benefits. Unless you consider deciding to use Facebook Messenger instead of your text messages, which definitely still work. I don't know the last time you used them, but they still work. That you would actually use that as a daily utility and you see that as worthwhile. But you're not getting paid, even though everyone else is getting paid off of your assets that you've produced. So the next level of data ownership besides transparency and consent is actually your right to monetize your own assets for yourself. It's your value that you've created. It's personal information about you and about your activities that you've generated through your actions. Yet somehow it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry and you don't have any of that dividend in your bank account. So Governor Gavin Newsom of California has a new law called the Data Dividend Law, which is really exciting. It basically says that any companies that are monetizing your personal data need to not only tell you what data they're monetizing about you, but how much they're earning off of it and give you a cut. Also, Senator Mark Warner has national legislation that is looking at the same thing, which it's a whole package of laws which deal with everything from transparency from companies over what they hold on you, all the way to banning malicious uses of algorithms. So saying that specifically like pushing hatred and violent-based communications to the top of your news feed should no longer be the way that your data can be used in an algorithm against you on Facebook, right? So there's a lot of different nuances to that, but those are some of the pieces of legislation that I think are so incredibly important. Now, before I start going on a Facebook rant, maybe you want to comment on any of that.
Oh, no, I was actually just going to take us into the slightly political realm.
Go for it. My favorite.
Yes. So, so outside of the Facebook realm, which, yes, you could rant on, I think all of just you and I could definitely rant on that. I'm sure many people in the room could as well. It is, so when we think about politics and we think about all this new legislation that's coming up, how likely do you think it is that this legislation is going to pass if we still have a Republican-controlled Senate and we still have a Republican president in the White House?
So these laws are completely bipartisan. This is bipartisan support for a lot of these laws, really, because this is not asking companies to break their business model. This is just asking companies to stop abusing people. That's it. It's consumer protection, and that's very, very basic. These are laws that have been in our government and in our regulatory system from the beginning of time. So the idea that companies are literally exploiting you and earning trillions of dollars off of you is a consumer protection issue. Look at what the FTC has already started, tens and tens of investigations. Mark Zuckerberg has had to pay $5 billion to them, and they have their first massive budget to invest in consumer protection. You can thank some of my work for that. But these are issues that we're starting to dig into. What does consumer protection really mean in a digital age? What does it mean for a company to say that you actually have a transparent relationship with your customers and that you are protecting them and that you're handling their data appropriately? Well, it's starting to get to the point where companies are making so much money just off of selling your data to third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, sixth parties, that at some point that this is complete exploitation. And when we talk about us getting a dividend off of that, it's actually a completely legitimate ask. It's not saying, okay, Mark, redistribute the $500 billion that Facebook is worth to your 1.3 billion users. We're literally not asking that. We're saying give a small percentage of what you are earning off of personal data back to the people that you have earned it from. Very small. And something that I think is really important to point out is that this is a concept that, again, does not mean that people need to destroy their business models. In fact, you could probably get people to share a lot more data if you were transparent about what you wanted the data for and you just actually asked your consumers. Most companies spend the majority of their budget when we're talking about data-driven communications and having a consumer relationship with your customers. They use most of it in buying and licensing data and getting data engineers and data scientists to match and hygiene the data. That means if I buy 10 data sets about you and 8 of them say you're a woman, 2 of them say you're a man, obviously AI and data scientists manually sometimes are going to say, okay, well, she's a woman, I'm going to clean those 2 incorrect data points out of that. Now, that is incredibly time-consuming and expensive, and you could probably go on and on about like how big of a job that is and how it's the biggest part of most data-driven projects. Now, if I just talked to all of my consumers and I said, hey, here's the 100 data points that I have on you. Is all of this still valid? Is that still where you live? And by the way, I don't know what you had for breakfast. Do you want to tell me? And I'm going to give you 20% off your next purchase. Okay, I would do it. I'm very happy to share my data. I just want to know who's going to have it, what they're going to do with it. And you know what? Give me a positive incentive to share it with you. That was actually since you mentioned blockchain earlier, before I left Cambridge, and one of the reasons why I stayed as long as I did was because we were building a blockchain-based solution for the advertising industry. We had become an ad company by the end of it, where most of our work was actually commercial. And we realized that we were wasting most of our clients' money with all of the fraud in the advertising industry, with bots and fake accounts, clicking on Facebook and Twitter, and illegal clicks on Google. None of this, probably at least half of it isn't real, right? And so you could get a much higher impact if you actually had a direct consumer relationship, and I could provide you a platform where you know that a consumer has seen an advertisement, for sure, and you know that that person is being targeted off of valid data because that consumer is controlling their data, they own it themselves, they're hygiening it themselves, so they're keeping it up to date for me, and whenever I want new data, I can just push them a notification and a question, and they can answer that, as opposed to me buying and licensing data sets from around the world and matching them and trying to make sure they're valid. So that's really where I see the future, that sort of transparency where it works well for companies. Companies will save time and money. It works well for individuals because we're not being exploited and we're actually being recognized as valuable as we are. I don't know, what do you think?
So I think that's a great idea. I think one of the biggest concerns that I see from companies like this is that they tend to get paid on an FTE model. So that means that if you don't have 20 people on that account, you're not going to make as much money. And I think that that's one of the biggest impediments that I see to something like that. Because you're right. Right now, I have teams of people that they go through and they clean data. And actually, there's one guy that I don't think he was able to make it tonight, but he will have missed this because he'll have appreciated this. Routinely asks me, Tiffany, how do I know that this is accurate? I've looked at this data point and I pulled this data source and it says 2 completely different things, so how do I know which one is accurate? And there are times when I'm honestly at a loss to be able to tell him which one is accurate because we have to go back and then validate the data. And it's something that takes an extensive amount of time. So I would say that I think this is a great idea. I do wonder a little bit about how do we as companies clean that, keep that data clean. I mean, having somebody else keeps that, they'll keep their data clean for us. But then, what do we do with this workforce? What comes next for all of our data scientists, all of our people that they're smart? I think they could shift, but where would they shift? What comes next?
Well, a lot of the technical jobs that I see coming up are people that are building digital identity solutions, because it's not just going to be, the Facebook wallet. That becomes what we all use every day. There's an opportunity for thousands,
Wait,
tens
do people use the Facebook wallet?
Not if Congress has anything to do with it. But I think that digital identity is going to be, it already is one of the biggest issues that people are seeking to solve right now in technology. Most of the developers that I talk to are working on at least one project that has to do with how you can own your data, how you can own your identity, and actually even have different identities for logging into different things. An example that often gets brought up is if I'm going into a bar or a club and the bouncer is asking to verify that I'm old enough to be in there, I hand them my passport or my driver's license, and all of a sudden that person has all of my information, sometimes even my home address and my picture, my height, my eye color, my height, all of these things, right? And that's way more information than the bouncer needs to know. They just need to know that I am at least 21 years of age. That is it. So the idea that you would be able to scan a wallet that has your verified identity, and that bouncer doesn't get anything besides a verification that you are 21 years old, that is perfect. That is good enough. And it means that that bouncer does not know where I live and will not need to remember my hair color and my eye color. It's just not important, right? So the idea that you can manage different identities and the way that you would log into different websites, log into your bank accounts, log into even physical spaces, now that IoT and location-based marketing is proliferating all over. I think it's really important to start to think about what data do people need about you when you need to present data, what's important, and then what are you fully controlling yourself? So what do you decide to share? What do you decide not to share, and when is that appropriate? So I think the technical talent will be put to very good use. I think hygiening data is a really bad use of really smart people.
I can agree with that, and I can also tell you that the idea of an ID that only shows the data that you want it to show, that is controllable on your mobile device, look for it very soon. I'm glad that you're talking about that. I have clients that are currently working on that, and very, very soon. So look for something like that, actually, probably in the next year. So excited to see that that is indeed something that you're also thinking about and that you're seeing in the industry, because it's coming soon, very, very soon.
Definitely. I mean, the digital identity solutions are going to be where you control your data, because your identity is really just data about you. So whether it's, biometrics or your personal information or other data sets that you create that you may or may not want to sell or share on to companies or governments or researchers or what have you, that should all be able to be managed in the future in one place. At least that would be a lot easier right now than what we normally go through on a day-to-day basis. How many passwords do you have to remember? Some of you might use LastPass or something like that, but otherwise you probably actually have hundreds of passwords that, whether you are very good at your security and you have all of them written down at on a pencil and paper somewhere, or you actually have, complex, different encrypted solutions, however it is you manage it, the idea that in the future that is made a lot easier and that you only have to share what data is necessary and not log in with Google and Facebook now giving websites access to an enormous amount of data about you that you do not realize you are sharing when you click that login with Facebook button. The future will really have a lot of different solutions so that you are not so easily exploited as you are today.
All right, so let's take just a little bit of a sidestep here. Let's talk about your book. It is targeted. It came out Tuesday, right?
It did, yeah, one whole week.
Great. So what will we learn from this?
Great. So I don't know how many of you guys saw The Great Hack, the Netflix original documentary that followed me around for about 9 months. But if you did see it, thank you for watching. And you should know that the book is actually a prequel to that. So the book starts the day that I met the CEO of Cambridge Analytica in early 2014. And it goes throughout my whole journey there, traveling the world with Alexander Nix, learning all about data-driven communications and the different ways that data are used in politics and the way that governments use data, and all of the things that I saw that were very exciting and all the things I saw that were absolutely terrifying. And then coming out the other end, deciding to become a whistleblower and deciding to become a part of the solution, not the problem. And so it's about like a 4-year span that the book goes through. It really is very memoir style. But what you'll realize as you're reading the book is, again, how unprotected you are right now and how much your data is actually worth. I mean, how valuable all of this is to companies and governments and organizations around the world, and why you should care about how your data is used. Because, data is the most valuable asset on planet Earth, but you are not participating in that somehow. And there are ways to end this exploitation, and there are ways that can benefit companies, governments, and individuals. But really, it should start with individual protections. And what does that look like? What are the types of legislation and regulation that are going to protect us? And what are the essential characteristics of actually being data literate? How can you be data literate or have digital intelligence? How do you understand what your data rights are? Basic cybersecurity protocols. How do you understand how to be ethical online? I actually just started a foundation called the Own Your Data Foundation, where we're starting by teaching this to children. How can you prevent cyberbullying? How can you notice a phishing attack? How do you, et cetera, and so forth. I don't think that kids these days should be handed devices without actually understanding what it means and what all of the types of data that they are producing as they are using that in their own homes or on their way to and from school. So as you read that book, you'll really understand the gravity of the situation, how data is used for amazing things, and how data is abused by people who would abuse power whether they had data or not, to be honest. So it just gives them more opportunity to abuse you, having access to all of your personal information and anything you've ever done, right? And everything you're currently doing, because a lot of these systems are real time right now. It's real time. I don't want to freak you out if you aren't already freaked out, but there are probably at least thousands or tens of thousands of companies that know exactly where you are right now and know everyone else that's sitting in this room. So who you are associating with and where you are and where you're going home to at night and where to find you while you're sleeping. And that's just true. Unfortunately, Apple has allowed at least probably 2,500 companies to be streaming all of my data out of this phone right now while I'm sitting here. And there's nothing I can do to stop it, not even turning it off. So just think about that and realize that what I'm saying is not just a warning. It's kind of a wake-up call. You guys need to care about your most valuable assets being stolen from you, and think about on a day-to-day basis what you want to share and what you don't, and what it actually means to have the possibility of privacy. And I said I'm not a privacy campaigner, but I do believe that if you want your privacy, you should be allowed to have it. And there should be technology solutions, legislation, regulation, and the education awareness to allow you to have that privacy if that's what you want, right? So I do have a lot of books here. If anybody doesn't have one, you can get one. HarperCollins is over here, and I'm very happy to sign them and talk to you about it. And if you guys haven't seen The Great Hack, I do suggest it. It would be really hard to watch that and then not care because it is quite intense, and it does take you through a lot of what happened in 2015 and 2016 during the election cycle, and how data has been used in elections in other places in very similar ways to what we just saw here in the United States. So I know that there's a lot of amazing people in this audience, so
I think now's a great time to open it up for questions.
Yeah. Who's up first?
Over here. And we'll just have you talk really loudly if you want to stand up and ask your question.
If we were to be here 5 years from now, talking about the same things, what would be successful in the next 5 years and what would not? In other words, what do you see happening that's going to make these issues reduce, and what isn't going to be controlled?
Really good. Do you want to start?
Yes, absolutely. So the question is, what is going to be successful in the next 5 years? So what can we put in place that can make sure that we are successful and that we can control the success over the next 5 years?
And what is not going to be successful? What is not going to survive these next 5 years due to this growing awareness?
And I mean, I think I can say this here, but ad agencies are not going to survive this if they, I think if they do not start making moves now. If ad agencies do not start making moves now towards really helping push this agenda for people to own their data and to be responsible with it, to be responsible with the way that they are targeting people, all those pop-up ads, everything that you see that bombards you, I think that this is where it starts. And yes, legislation, making sure that you have the option to share your data or not share your data is very important. But advertising, billions and billions of dollars, and a lot of power. So I think it starts there.
Yeah, and just to riff off of that, because this was something that we worked really hard at Cambridge Analytica, which was making advertising less service heavy and more of a technology solution. So ad tech being the most important thing. So yeah, big advertising companies that have tons of creatives that are not looking at data and thinking that that model is still going to survive. I agree with you. That's going to die because everything is going to be data driven. And in order for brands or governments or politicians to talk to an individual, there's going to be technology that gives them a direct contact with their voters, with their clients, with their customers, with their citizens. And based off of the data that that citizen is willing to share, they will receive communications accordingly. But you're not going to need a massive creative team because there's no longer going to be any guesswork. You're not going to need all of these strategists because there's not going to be any guesswork. Again, that's if people have positive incentives to share their data and they have the knowledge that their data will be secure if they so choose to share it. So I totally agree with you. The ad agency model is going to be totally flipped on its head. What else I see? So I do not think that people are going to get away with kind of black boxy business models anymore. I really see the world going more towards radical transparency than radical privacy. I do see in about 5 years enough of us being aware of what it looks like to be targeted and what it looks like to not only see targeted advertising, but targeted news articles where the news article and especially the headline and the image is different for me than it is for Tiffany sitting next to me, right? People are going to start to recognize that, and if they see that they are being targeted according to their data because they've just had a conversation or just sent an email or just clicked on something, and then they see an entire communications campaign coming at them because of that, we're already starting to be aware of that, but I think people are going to start being a little bit less excited about that and a little bit more aware of what it takes for that type of targeted communication to come at them. So I think the more honest companies and governments and organizations are with the people they're communicating with, the more successful this is going to be. Again, I'm going to go back to the idea that we shouldn't be paying tons of smart people that have spent maybe 8 years in college with 1 million degrees hygiening data sets to find out if I'm a man or a woman. That's crazy. Why don't you just ask me? And you should hopefully soon, and I think that's more in the next year to 2 years, have a technology solution where if a brand or my government wants to contact me, they can contact me directly without all of these middlemen. They can send me a pop-up notification to ask me a question when they want to know something, when they need to know a data point, or they need to know if something that they already have in their database, if it's correct or not. So this type of transparency and consent is the way that we're hopefully going to see everything going forward, and I hope that answers your question.
Over here in the back? Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Dan. I work at a data ethics startup. I'm really huge fan of both of your work. Appreciate your courage around speaking out about such a difficult and really important topic. The question that I have is sort of how do you think about the tension between human rights and ownership? And I think you're in a really good place to think about that because of your background. And so when we talk about ownership, that implies a sense of property rights, the ability to transact things. And so when we're thinking about highly sensitive data and the ability to transact away our data, how does that square away with this idea that some things shouldn't be sold away? So for instance, should we have child labor? No. I mean, that's a human right we've created. We shouldn't be allowed to transact that away necessarily or create really strong limitations around that. And so that tension between this idea of ownership and property rights and human rights, I'd love to hear how you navigate that tension.
Yeah, of course. So I spent way too many years in law school, specifically working on human rights and then in the field as well. And I can tell you it's really, really difficult in a court of law to protect your human rights or the human rights of others. It's really difficult. A lot of times the cases get dropped, or you lose, or you are in a case for 6 years and the person you're suing dies. And this happens time and time again, both locally and internationally. Human rights are very hard fundamentally to protect because unless you actually have the infrastructure to protect those human rights, it's just difficult to enforce. That's why I have really moved my thought about personal data over to the property rights framework, because unfortunately this is the case, but property rights are the most protected right that you have in law, not just in the United States, in most countries. If someone violates your property, you can take them to court and you will win. Every time, definitely. There's no argument about that. You will win. You are so well protected and you have that legal recourse. And guess what? One of your fundamental human rights is the right to have property. So, of all of the human rights, that is the most enforceable, to have property. And yes, I think very sensitive personal data should be thought of as a human right, that you have the right to own that. There's no reason why a company like Equifax should allow all of our social security numbers and all of our financial data and every home that we've ever lived in our entire lives and all of our family's information to be hacked, and they just get a fine. They just get a fine. That's our personal information that for the rest of our lives, people can steal our identities. They can show up at our house. They can threaten our families. Are you kidding? Why aren't those people in jail? I've been trying my best, don't worry. But I think it's really going to change because, you know, if someone comes and breaks into your house and burns it down, guess what? They're definitely going to jail. So Equifax burned down the homes of over 150 million people, figuratively, and those people just have a small slap on the wrist. So a lot of laws that way are going to change because people are seeing data as property. In the state of Wyoming, your digital assets are your intangible personal property. In the state of Minnesota, because of McCarthy versus Equifax, I was an expert witness in the first successful case against Equifax. We sued Equifax for property damage, and we won at the Supreme Court. And that's because your property, your data, is now damaged because it is out there, and this is information like your name and your social security number. Well, you can actually change your name, but you can't change your social security number, and that sensitive information is now out there forever, and you have to deal with fraud and threats and everything else that comes with that for the rest of your life. So thank you, Senator Elizabeth Warren, but she put forward something called the Corporate Executive Accountability Act. And it means if through negligence, like with Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, the executives at Equifax, through negligence, you allow data leaks or hacking of personal sensitive information that you're holding about your customers, this is now criminal. You are going to jail. This is not a slap on the wrist fine. And I'm not saying that people that are running companies that really are meaning well and are doing well and are trying their best and licensing all of the cybersecurity software and they have whole teams working on this day in and day out. No, what I mean is if, like Equifax, you do not update your security, over 300 security certificates, you let them expire, and you don't update your software over 8,500 times, when the only business that you do is buying and selling people's personal data, then yeah, that is criminal negligence. So thank you, Senator Warren, for that. That's where I really see things going in less than 5 years. I see that passing in the next year. I really do. Next.
Slow catching up to this thing, right? Mm-hmm. We all got into this mess because we all really like to find where we're going on Google Maps. So we all love how fast things happen due to the technology of these companies. And so now, like, I don't search on anything other than Google, right? So in the world that you're describing, where I first, before I do anything, have to agree that Google can use this part of me, this part of me, and this part of me, and that's it, or none of it.
Yep.
In that world, does Google then get to say, well, you can't search with us, right? Don't they still own Like, how does, so then does another search engine come? I mean, like what's that vision?
Well, you can talk to this more so, but I think that's where legislation comes in. Honestly, I think that's the solution for it. And speaking of Elizabeth Warren, she's a big fan of breaking up big tech. They have become monopolies. They're just not the monopolies that we're used to seeing. They're not oil monopolies. They're not train monopolies, right? But they are tech monopolies. And so I think that's when legislation comes in. And you can definitely speak a lot more to that as well in terms of the legislation part.
Yeah, of course. But also on a technology level, when we're thinking about, I'm going to address your exact example. So if I want to use Google Maps, I do want to use Google Maps because Apple Maps is awful. I am very happy to share my location with Google if they're going to show me where I am on their map, and if they would like internally to use my location in order to better target me with ads. I'm totally okay with that because I think that that's a good trade. If they want to sell my data to other companies all around the world who have nothing to do with providing me my location on that map, then they should pay me for it, and they should tell me who they're sharing it with and what those companies intend to do with it. Pretty simple, in my opinion.
Right, and then the legislation, when they say, well, then get lost, literally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nicely-
that was good.
nicely
That was
done.
good. That was good.
But that's when the legislation.
Well, I think the legislation is what is needed to force them to do that. I don't think that Google's going to do that on their own.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've seen that if you leave most companies up to their own devices, they're not going to take an activist stand and make the ethical choice. That is definitely something that our legislators and regulators have to force. Unfortunately, it's come to that. We've let them run rampant for quite long enough. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. So for a long time, the advertising industry has been trying to find a way around this. Years ago, we had the OBA, the online behavioral, so that you could say whether there's a list of all the companies that are using your data for advertising. You can turn them on and off. There was Ghostery, Safari. All these companies try to do stuff. The IB tried to do something in Europe before GDPR. I found that in general, most people are like, whatever, I want them to know my location. Most people don't actually opt out. And so do you really think that the average person is gonna say, oh God, I don't want them to know this, and actually take action? Because I feel like this has been building for many years, and you also have, in terms of the next 5 years, like all the online behavioral targeting companies, like they're still around. No one's, they're still operating. So do you really think that this is going to happen?
Yeah, so again, I don't think anytime soon will the average person actually decide to go deep into the terms and conditions and their settings and protect themselves in the way that some of the people in this room might decide to. But you know why that is? One, we're not digitally or data literate enough to understand how to protect ourselves, and two, the terms and conditions and the settings have been made in a very complex and manipulative way so that we do not do that. Can I get a show of hands of how many people have read their terms and conditions recently on anything that you've downloaded?
We have a couple. We have one here. We've got a couple over here.
So you would probably never, ever get a pile of paper contracts on your desk and sit there and flip to the end and sign it, flip to the end and sign it, and just hand them back without having read any of them.
We've got to have a couple lawyers. It's got to be lawyers, right?
At least a couple lawyers.
That's, yeah.
Or at least some personal time where you actually read it with your own eyes. But you would never do that. That is what you do sometimes hundreds of times a day online. You sign all these contracts without reading it. And I have one friend here in the audience, Joe Toscano, who specifically is solving that problem at the Beacon Trust, where he has created ethical options for terms and conditions, where you actually see in a very easily readable, almost bullet point format, these are the things you're agreeing to. If you want to know more, you can click and know more, not in legalese, in plain English that anybody can understand. And guess what? If some of these things you are not comfortable with, you can toggle them on and off. And if you toggle all of them off, you can still use the product. Genius. This type of simplicity and transparency should not be novel. That should be commonplace. And so I think we're going to start to see a lot of changes in that. You guys have probably noticed changes in that. I don't know if you've said no to cookies recently, and they've said, okay, well, you have some other options. And you can toggle on and off who they might be sharing your cookie data with if you allow them to drop at least one cookie. Trust me, they're still begging to get your data, but they're not forcing it down your throat so much anymore. So,
Not so much.
yeah.
You want to take one more question over here?
Okay, this may be more for Tiffany because you've spent most of your career in advertising, and I have too, just a few more years.
Probably.
For better or worse. The question is, do we really need to legislate our way out of this solely, or can the private sector take the lead as it did in the development of the internet and all the great, inventions other than the Defense Department maybe? And could we, for example, show our clients how they can gain competitive advantage by becoming the most transparent company? I mean, imagine if Apple decided to do this in a big way and spend billions of dollars against that value proposition. Why can't the ed industry actually be the leader in this solution instead of relying on the process of government by showing the client the opportunity of the white space they have to use this as a differentiator and a purchase driver for their business?
I love that question. That is a good question. And I will tell you that it is my sincere hope. And first, it's my sincere hope that it's not just legislation, because I honestly don't think legislation alone is going to solve this problem. There's absolutely no way that our government should actually be wholly responsible for this. So it is my genuine hope that ad agencies, that companies, massive companies, recognize that this is an opportunity, that they're not afraid of this. They're not afraid to lose their FTEs, because what they're gaining instead of that is they're gaining people who are not only incredibly intelligent, because they are incredibly intelligent. I've worked with amazing people in this industry, but their talents are being wasted by digging into data, cleaning data, and not actually interpreting that data for more useful actions. And so I think that I would love to see ad agencies do this. I would love to see an ad agency decide that they want to champion this cause and they want to be leaders in the industry. I think historically, advertising companies have led the way. Advertising has opened doors. They've made you see things differently, for better or worse. I think that they have made improvements and made massive impacts in our consumer behavior, the way that you have proper hygiene, the wedding rings that you wear, the fact that you wear a diamond. And so I think that advertising agencies right now, they're a little bit lost in haven't quite grasped what is next. And I think that they have the possibility and they have the potential to grab onto this and to project themselves into the future to save themselves. So in 5 years, they are still here and they are leading the industry again. And how they do that is by, exactly as you said, understanding that this is nothing to be afraid of, that this is something that they could be revolutionaries in promoting.
Get out in front of instead of following.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with that. I want to make it very clear that I do not believe that throwing legislation and regulation on things fixes things. Because you know what? Most of these laws and regulations that we've discussed in the past hour are not enforceable without technology. This is really a solution for technologists, not for legislators. But unfortunately, there's only so fast that all of the technologists can move, while unfortunately a lot of other big tech companies are still abusing people. So we need to be building the technology solutions that will allow the legislation and regulation that is coming and is coming very soon to be enforceable, to have data be trackable and traceable, to have us be able to own our own identity, and for us to receive rewards and incentives very easily and transparently for that use case, for that data, and to have those permission structures. So, yeah, I mean, I think do we have time for one more? Are we almost finished here? What time is it?
And I don't know if we know what time is it. Good.
7:20.
I think maybe we have time for like one or two more,
Yeah,
and then
perfect.
some book signings.
Great.
Um,
Joe.
Wait, we have
So how do you deal with the fact of translating this? Give him a microphone.
Oh, here, there's one here.
Okay, thank you.
I'll switch to you. Thanks, Dave.
Is this sensitive? Okay, we got it. So how do you deal with the fact that online attacks are often, it's kind of like a mountain lion, right? Like anyone that's been out in the woods, we know we've been watched, we've been stalked, but we haven't actually felt the impact because there's no mountain lion coming down attacking us. How do you explain that to the general public and translate the value of our data beyond just economic value, but the actual impact on our lives?
That's the reason why I spent the past year writing that book. Because I think without actually seeing a use case of how you can be abused with your personal information, then you don't really understand it. In there, I give examples of some of the types of messaging that were specifically used, in the Trump campaign and by the Trump super PACs, where people were targeted with their data that showed that they were vulnerable, that they made their decisions based off of fear, or that they may belong to a particular minority, or be a particular gender and live in a certain vulnerable area. And messages were sent to people, maybe even some of us in this room, that were made for us to hate the person next to us, that were made for us to disengage in politics, that were made for us to not care about voting anymore. That's when you start to realize that if anybody has access to your data and you don't know what they're going to do with it, that is a problem, and it's a fundamental problem of transparency and consent. And what those attacks look like could be different every single time. Trust me, some of the people that went to the Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter rallies that were organized by Russia thought that they were doing something meaningful that was organized by people in their community. But they weren't. In fact, they showed up to a rally right next to an opposing rally that was specifically made to incite violence. And it hurts me to say it because I was there and I saw it. But it's something that should stand as a warning for how vulnerable some of us actually are and the amount of our data that actually exists about us all around the world, what that can be used for, and the reasons why we need to prevent this from happening again.
I think we had a question here. Yeah, you're gonna grab it.
Actually, I got the microphone.
Hi, so my name is Daniel. I work for the Austrian Trade Commission, and I've been posted the last 3 years in Southeast Asia. And so I was at a conference that was about cashless payments. And of course, data ownership and the whole topic is very important connected to cashless payments. And there was a whole conference about this topic, and nobody talked about data privacy, data ownership. So one of my European colleagues stood up and was like, so aren't you afraid that the government will have all access to all your data? I mean, what's with data privacy? I mean, you're talking about creating super apps that track, like one single app tracks your entire behavior connected to your payments. And the response was, well, if you're a good person, you're nothing to be afraid of, right? And like all the people, the Thai people in the room were like, yep, right, that's correct. And all the Europeans were like, what's going on? What the hell? So I'm putting a layer of corporate on that. And so don't you think that like restricting or making stricter data laws on this side of the world might companies eventually be less competitive to companies on the other side of the world in Asia when they have so much less restrictions because there is just a different set of mentality towards that? Thanks.
There's definitely a very different mentality. That's for sure.
I think though, can I say something, Brittany?
You can.
Oh, thank you. I think that the big problem here is the leverage that a large company like Google gets to have over a user by saying, either take our way or get out of here. So I think if there was any kind of a law, if a company is using public internet, in other words, the right of way of an internet, like if you run a cable and it crosses one property line, that's on public property. So if someone is using public property, then they have to obey net neutrality, and they have to give everybody their service whether or not they agree to the terms and conditions. And this acceptance that, okay, I'll give in and say, I'll take the map on the condition that I give them my data. Well, they shouldn't really have the ability to leverage that like that. And let's see what would happen if Facebook, Google, whatever, had to offer their service regardless of whether or not terms and conditions are followed.
Yeah, and that's
think
where
we'll see
things are
that
going. Definitely. Like whether you agree to give your data or not, you should be allowed to use these services. I should still be able to read this article without this massive pop-up box that asks me if they can drop socially acceptable spyware onto my computer or not. And they call it cookies because it sounds nice and sweet, like the ones that we have over there. But you know, it's spyware. That's all that it is, right? So whether I agree to that or not in the future, I will still be able to use those public goods because with no prejudice. And I totally agree with you. And I want to make sure that I'm wrapping that into what you brought up, which is the competitiveness of companies. I truly believe that if companies have a more transparent and consensual relationship with their consumers, that they will do better. Why? A couple reasons. One, they are not going to have the type of drop-off that a lot of companies and brands see because you'll actually have a stronger, more honest relationship. You'll tell the consumers what you need from them and they'll tell you what they want, and then you can more easily give them what they want, right? That's the whole point of data-driven communications and advertising. You're giving people what they want, but be honest with them about how you are giving them what they want, right? And when you want extra data from them in order to give them a better experience or to design new products, ask them, and you're gonna end up with a lot more data than you would have otherwise, and you're going to end up with valid data that is real time and up to date. I have worked and traveled and lived in a lot of countries where, like as you said, the government owns all of the data and all of the companies are basically owned by the government. And guess what? My friends input incorrect data all of the time, and a lot of their most sensitive activities or even their day-to-day interests, they turn their phone off and take out the battery, and they make sure that they are not being tracked and they don't create that data. So it's that type of surveillance state that might seem like a good idea. It might seem like certain companies in those countries are going to do better because they can still do whatever they want and have access unfettered to everyone's data. But guess what? Those data sets are not always real time. A lot of them is fake data, and people are not willing to give them more data than they physically have to in order to use those services because of that lack of transparency, right? And so that's why, you know, for all the blockchain enthusiasts in here, we're now kind of creeped out about what the Chinese Communist Party is going to do with blockchain, when they can track and trace everyone else's data, all of their financial data, as well as everything else that they already own about them. And, you know, we should be scared about that. And I think we should say for our values in this country and in many other countries that are going to think along these lines that we've been discussing tonight, that we believe in individual rights and we believe that individuals should be able to make a choice. They should be able to have their privacy, or they should be able to be entrepreneurial and sell and license their data and get paid for it. But it's more about individual rights, especially in this country. It always has been. And Europe has already made the moves to say the same thing, that they respect their citizens' rights over the rights of companies to do whatever they want. Right? And so I think it's an important conversation, but I want to make very clear that I do not believe that companies are sacrificing something by being transparent with us. It shouldn't be a sacrifice. Yeah.
We have one more question here from the back, if that's okay.
Oh, please do, Robert.
This is going to be a very interesting question. This is an individual who visited Cambridge Analytica in 2016, December, I think so, at the time of the debrief period from what was done on the Trump campaign. And it was a roundtable at our commercial office, which had you, it had the Red Nose campaign, it had Advertising Week, it had like a number of key industry players.
I remember that very well.
Who could, you know, affect change. And so you wanted to ask a question, right?
Please do.
That's
Good to see you again.
Some build up. Wow, that build up. Thank you. No, my question is a two-parter, but it's one question really. So, what do you think of the current legislation being proposed? Because it ultimately seems like the pendulum is swinging too far the other way, right? We're making everything opt-in, which is in a lot of ways going to break a lot of things going on the internet. And so the other part of the question is, do legislators actually understand that, right? Because I get it that, utopian idea that all privacy, all data is going to be owned, self-owned, but a lot of people like the fact that when I get off the airplane, the car's waiting for me and my data knows where I am. So a lot of people like the stuff that comes out of data, and those kind of things are not going to be possible if the legislation goes the way it's going now. So what do you think about the legislations, and do people really understand the implications?
So that is mainly what I've been working on for the past year and a half, because I realized very quickly when I started doing both public and closed-door testimonies and meetings with legislators and regulators that they do not fully understand, not all of them, all of the technology that they are legislating on. So I created DATA, the Digital Asset Trade Association, specifically to bring technologists and legislators together so that technologists could explain to legislators exactly what it was that they have built, the way that these things work, and where are the loopholes, and where are the allowances that entrepreneurs need in order to innovate. Because the last thing we want to do is squash innovation while we're trying to protect people from abuse. But we really do need to protect people from abuse because it's gotten really bad. So it's about balancing that out and making sure that the legislators and regulators really understand what it is they're doing. As I said, I don't think you should just throw laws and regulation on things to fix it. We don't want to over-regulate and over-legislate and, again, become uncompetitive or stifle innovation. No, 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 not at all. But I do think we need a basic level of security in this country. Now, another thing that I think it's interesting that you brought up, a lot of people play into this idea that if we become fully opt-in and we're pre-opted out, we have to opt into everything, that it's somehow going to break the way that everything works right now. I'm sorry to tell all of you, but all of the data that people already own about you, you're never getting that back. Your privacy is gone, my friend. I'm talking about all the data that we create from here forward, the data that's created by our children and our grandchildren. The way that the internet runs and the way that all of you run your companies and government organizations, that's still going to continue because none of us are getting that data back. We can't claw that back. That's not happening. So things are going to continue to run the way that they run. But when we start to own our identities and the future data that we produce, if people want access to our new and our real-time data, then they're going to have to enter into a contractual relationship with us. It can be easy as a button and a smart contract where I can toggle on and off what I want to share and what I don't, and then I can start receiving compensation from those companies. And guess what? They're going to get good data, they're going to get usable data, they're going to get real-time data, and actually their companies are probably going to start running better, to be honest. And I speak to tons of technologists around the world every day that totally agree with that. So. Thank you.
I think this is a fantastic point to start things bringing to a conclusion. I know that some people are a bit hungry and dire for a drink. We didn't manage to get the bar opened up here, so apologies. Yeah, let's wrap it up and continue that in private. But do say your thank yous and all that stuff. And thank you very much for everything. It was great.
Can you tell us how we can access the Own Your Data campaign?
Yes, thank you. Firstly, thank you, Robert, for organizing this, and Tiffany for being our amazing host, you guys. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here amongst amazing people and in a building that is entertaining an Own Your Data conversation. Technically, it's you personally, but I still love it. And so, accessing the Own Your Data campaign, if you go to ownyourdata.foundation, that's my new nonprofit where we're doing digital literacy education, first in schools and then with legislators and with companies as well. So you can learn more about all of the activities that are going on at the legislative and regulatory level, how to get involved in data and ethics programs, and how to train yourself to be more digitally intelligent or data literate. And all of the different solutions that are out there these days that I think represent a good portfolio of people that are making the ethical choice and are being a part of the solution, not the problem. So, thank you, guys.
Thank you.